The opinions and views expressed in the following presentation do not necessarily reflect those of GameCon Radio or its affiliates.
Banshee's Lair, Visionary Talk Radio on GameConRadio.com. We rock your world.
Good evening, and welcome to the Howard Phillips Lovecraft Radio Hour. Tonight's reading will be a spine-gripping story, one of my personal favorites, The Picture in the House. Searchers after horror haunt strange far places. For them are the catacombs of Beg your pardon? You want me to warn them? Well, what do you mean, liability for audio-induced cardiac arrest? Oh, just give me the damn prompt. Many apologies for the interruption. It seems there are a few inquiries I need to make of you before we can begin the show. First inquiry. Are you now, or have you ever been the sufferer of heart trauma, brain clots, bouts of fainting, sweaty palms, cold feet, or other fear-induced maladies that might prevent you from fully enjoying the program? Moving onward. Second question. Oh, you can't be serious. Fine, just don't hold me responsible for our ratings drop. Second question. Are you now, or have you ever been, admitted to an asylum for the insane? If so, was your madness related to dreams of vast cyclopean realms or expeditions to ruins of elder races? I apologize for the wording, dear audience. This is simply being done to ensure your safety and peace of mind. Never mind the tattered pieces of my own psychological well-being. At any rate, continuing down the list... Can I get someone to shut the window? It's getting hard to read with all this damned wind. Oh, great. Just wonderful. How am I supposed to carry on under this shroud of darkness? It's not enough to halt the entire production now. Who is breathing down my neck? Oh, God, that stench. Jeffrey, is that you? Have you been dipping Cheetos in ranch dressing again? Where did I put that matchbook? Jeffrey! Not so close, you'll drool on the upholstery! Jeffrey? I say! Calm down, you're starting to frighten me! Here we go. Now we can...
Welcome to Mo Banshee's Lair, Visionary Talk Radio on GameConRadio.com. We are rocking your game tonight with Donovan Loucks, who has a site called HP Lovecraft.com, and it is a very comprehensive site, and you can find it at www.hplovecraft.com. If you want to maybe bring that up, people that are, using their PCs and all, you can bring it up and maybe look at the site while we're doing crazy but news. Let me just put that into the thing, and I'm so proud of myself that I got his name right, Loucks. And so we welcome to everybody in the chat room, everybody listening on players, whether it's Winamp, we love you all, whatever. whatever way you're finding your way to us, we love you, and please pass our links around. Make sure everybody knows that we are now loading shows onto YouTube, and I keep the most recent shows on the Podomatic, and you can download from Podomatic if you want to save the show. New Jersey, from News 12 Weather Center, the National Weather Service has issued a high wind warning for coastal Ocean and eastern Monmouth County. That would be me. Effective through Thursday at 5 a.m. Coastal flood warning. That's going to be through Thursday 8 a.m. And another wind advisory till 6 p.m. on Thursday for Ocean, Western Monmouth. We're going to get nailed by a nor'easter. There are nor'easterns, and then there are nor'easterns. And lately we've been getting the big ones. And so I'm going to ask people to make sure you have all the things you need if you have to get out fast, right at the door. Make sure you have your animals, you know, food, medicine, carriers. Make sure you have candles. Make sure you have water. If it looks like it's getting too rough to be in the house, it probably is. Find out before the storm hits where your safe place is, where the local school is that they're going to let you in. You can't wait until the water is coming in the door, folks. We are on the ocean. When you open the door here, the Atlantic Ocean is there. And it's not going to stop because you say, wait a minute, I didn't pack up the stuff yet. So please be smart. Get your animals in so you can get to them easily. And make sure you've got your cell phone charged, and in your little, you know, what do they call those? Those little packs, your evac pack, your whatever you want to call it, have your chargers, you know, for your phone so you can charge the phone. Have your phone book so you, in case your phone dies, you still can call somebody because you have their number and you can borrow somebody else's phone. Don't wait until it's too late, okay? So that's my little public service thing for tonight. I want to remind everybody that all the animal shelters are really struggling to keep up with animals that are being dumped, animals that are being just abandoned. Please, if you can help out your local shelter, please do. Animals did nothing to deserve that. And, you know, if you think starving to death isn't bad, then you try it. Or you think that being out in terrible weather isn't bad, then you try it. So please report animal abuse, neglect to the proper authorities. And if they don't listen, go to the newspapers. They love that stuff. Crazy Butt News. We have another comet that they're watching. It was just noticed this year. And it's coming close enough to Mars that many scientists are getting nervous that it might actually nail it. It's a comet named C/213A1. And it's going to pass within a few tens of thousand miles of Mars center. And they're kind of nervous. They're calling it the siding spring, because they think it might like nail it, like graze it. They're not sure exactly how it is, but they're watching it, and it is supposed to be a rather large thing too. Let me see, I'm trying to go down. The comet would be moving 35 miles per hour at the 35 miles per hour at the time of impact, and it would create probably a 1.5 mile deep crater. So it's significant, but we're not going to get hit with it. But get ready with your little buckets in case Mars is blown, you know, apart, and you maybe can get some Mars, you know, asteroids and sell it to NASA and get rich that way, you know. I don't know. There's a deadly bacteria out. This isn't funny. It's not crazy. It's scary. I do not go to the hospital when I'm sick because I don't want MRSA. MRSA is almost drug resistant at this point, and I know so many friends who have died from it already now. But this new bacteria even makes that look like a wimp. It's called CRE, and it's rising in medical centers, in hospitals and nursing homes. People with impaired immune systems like me, I have lupus, people with MS, people with, autoimmune diseases are not doing well with it. And it's called a superbug. It's untreatable so far. They've found nothing that will stop it, except that the patient dies. So I guess my big thing would be is please, people, take your vitamins and don't go run into the emergency room for no reason at all. Call your doctor, tell him, look, I got a cold, I got a cough, whatever. But because this stuff is bad, and it's getting worse. The biggest threat to patient safety in the hospital is what we have, and that's from the infectious disease doctors for the disease control. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like anything is going to slow it down or slow the spreading of it. So please, people, wash your hands and don't play kissy face with people. Oh, I haven't seen you in forever. Kiss them. Don't do that stuff. Say hi. I haven't seen you forever, and I'm not touching you either. That's what I do, and everybody's okay with that. There's a drug group here in New Jersey that's been fined $45 million because they have one of these put weight on pills. You'll gain weight for people that are frail in nursing homes and hospice. They said it was a miracle pill, and it's nothing. It does absolutely nothing, and they swindled everybody that bought it. So this drug maker in New Jersey is in big, big trouble for $45 million in fines. And that's it. That's, I think, the crazy but news. We're going to be bringing Donovan on. Donovan is our guest tonight, and he runs the HP Lovecraft.com. And I'm trying to bring out the other thing because HP Lovecraft said, the oldest, strangest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strangest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. And after this week, I have to tell you, I think I agree a little bit with John Carpenter that he said, I think Lovecraft was kind of nuts. And I got to agree. I guess suffering for your art is the way to go, because he and Poe seem to have been real oddballs, and now they may not have been famous in life, but man, are they famous now. Welcome to the lair, Donovan.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
Oh, yeah. Your fascination started when?
Oh my goodness, it was probably my late teens. That's not uncommon. A lot of guys seem to encounter Lovecraft in their late teens, and there's something about Lovecraft that kind of draws them in. You'll actually hear that from a lot of guys who are interested in Lovecraft, that's when it hit them.
Metallica.
Not in my case. I'm familiar with Metallica's song, The Call of Cthulhu, The Thing That Should Not Be, and things like that. But no, I've never been much of a Metallica fan myself. I'm
not either. So you just kind of fell over the books, the stories, right?
Yeah, with me, it was kind of unusual. When I was a kid, I read horror pretty widely. I remember reading lots of Poe when I was a kid. I have a vague recollection of encountering Lovecraft's name, but not actually finding any of his books. Could be a false memory for all I know. But when I really got introduced to him was probably in my late teens. In 1981, the role-playing game Call of Cthulhu came out, and I saw that, didn't play it, didn't even buy it at the time, and that just the mention of Lovecraft's name on the box got me interested. And so I started tracking down books, which were much more widely available then. And I just got sucked into it at that point and started reading not just Lovecraft, but a lot of other authors who Lovecraft had inspired.
Yeah. He credits Edgar Allan Poe because he came after Edgar Allan Poe. Do you think they had a lot in common, these two guys?
In some respects, yes. They certainly both lived pretty short lives. The big difference I see between the two is that while they were both talented, Lovecraft always saw himself as a gentleman of leisure and who didn't engage in his art for the sake of commercialism, and so he never found any real jobs in his whole life, and really wasn't paid much for his writing. Poe busted his butt doing work. He had the editorship of several magazines. Took his show on the road, reciting the Raven and other poems. And Poe, for the most part, kept his nose to the grindstone, at least by comparison to Lovecraft. So there was a considerable difference in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Poe was more like, your drunken uncle. And the Lovecraft seemed to be more like the uncle that went tisk, 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 Kind of.
Yeah, it's tough to look at these guys through the lens of history because, if you tell a story about some crazy friend of yours who did something, and you tell enough of those stories to someone else, they'll just think this friend of yours is just completely nuts. Well, you forgot to tell them that all these crazy occurrences happened over a 30-year period, and you get the wrong impression of someone when the facts of their life are compressed down to a biography that you read in a few hours or a couple of days. And so it's very easy to look at people like Poe and Lovecraft and call them crazy because you see all their warts at once. People think of Poe. Poe has that bad reputation of being a drunkard. But I don't think drink took him as badly as a lot of people seem to think he does. I think he was very susceptible to drink. He was prone to get drunk very easily, but I don't think he took to the bottle quite as much as people, the general populace at least, thinks he did.
Yeah, the guest we had on last week, because you were here listening to it too, and thank you. But they said the same thing, and it's easy to sit on the outside and look and say, oh, wow. Let's put it this way. People look at the President of the United States and they don't get up. They don't see what he sees every day. And yet they judge him, And then 30 years later, you find out what, the guy had to deal with, and what was going on in his life. And then they go, oh, well, we didn't know. No, you just tore them apart, and made assumptions. One thing I do see in both of them is they had morbid interests in writing about death and kind of things that are taboo.
Yeah, Poe's interests were definitely more towards the macabre, in my opinion, than Lovecraft's. Where Poe wrote at length about death and about the death of a beautiful woman, that whole Gothic movement. Lovecraft, on the other hand, while he obviously wrote horror, and towards the end of his life, his horror kind of transmuted somewhat into science fiction. A lot of his stories only deal, arguably, with horror in a tangential way. They're really about Lovecraft's philosophy of cosmicism, the notion that the universe is, there is no God, there is no supernatural power at work in the universe, and we don't even have free wills. Lovecraft was a mechanistic materialist, and so that idea of this unfeeling cosmos that didn't even notice human beings came and went was present in a lot of his stories. So even though he deals with a lot of horrific subjects, a lot of it is to convey that cosmic idea.
Mm-hmm. And he also, in some of them, it kind of felt like we aren't alone. There's other things going on that we don't know about, right? Because some of the stories, they went underground and there was this society under there and stuff. So in a way, he's kind of saying we don't see everything there is to see.
Right. Those presences in his stories, that wasn't something he necessarily believed in, but they did symbolize the idea that there's a great deal we don't know about the universe, and yet the universe really doesn't care about us. These entities that he described also didn't care about us, so they were symbolic of the cosmos's indifferentness to us.
Mm-hmm. What's your favorite story?
Oh, without a question, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. I wouldn't recommend it necessarily to first-time readers of Lovecraft. It's one of his longest works. He only wrote 3 novellas. He wasn't a novel writer, but it's a story set in Providence. Providence is kind of the main character in a way, and it has some flashback scenes to colonial-era Providence. And if you're familiar with Providence, like I am, and its history, it's really a wonderful story.
Has that been made to a movie?
Yes, actually, it's been made into a couple of movies. The first one was, strangely enough, called The Haunted Palace, which is the name of an Edgar Allan Poe story. And it was actually the first Lovecraft film made back in 1963, and it was one of Roger Corman's Poe movies starring Vincent Price. But it wasn't a Poe movie. It was just The Haunted Palace was the title taken from the Lovecraft or the Poe poem of the same name, but it was actually an adaptation of Lovecraft's The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. And it's an interesting film. You know, it's not a great film. It's actually got a decent rating on the Internet Movie Database. It's a fun film. It's also got Lon Chaney Jr. in it, and you'll recognize other character actors in it, like Deborah Paget and Elisha Cook. And it's clearly a Corman film when you watch it with the castle sets and the lightning and thunder and that sort of thing. But it's fairly enjoyable. That's the first one that was an adaptation of The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. The other one is The Resurrected. That was made in 1992, and that starred Chris Sarandon, who is probably better known for Fright Night, I think.
Yeah.
And that was directed by Dan O'Bannon, the same guy who wrote the script for Alien. And I actually think that's not only a far superior adaptation, it's actually one of my favorite Lovecraft films, The Resurrected. Unfortunately, from what I've heard, it's been chopped up a bit by the studio, and it's not available in a widescreen format. But his wife, Dan O'Bannon, died a few years ago, and his wife, Diane, has the work print of it. So there's always hope that a widescreen director's cut, as it were, the version that Dan O'Bannon submitted to the studio will be released. But who knows?
Sometimes these things work well with, getting it out. A lot of people I've talked to now say they just make these things and go to DVD, which I think is a bit of a pain in the can, because then really good movies, solid movies don't get seen, things that you would really enjoy. One of the movies that I love, it has nothing to do with this, but is Stir of Echoes with Kevin Bacon.
That's an excellent film. It's based on, I believe, a Richard Matheson story, and that's a terrific. I almost hesitate to call it a horror film. There are supernatural elements in it, but it's kind of a murder mystery almost.
And why didn't it do anything? Because 2 months before release date, The Sixth Sense came out.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so we were looking in the video store back then. They had the video store, you went and browsed the video. And Teddy's looking, he says, here, this looks like something we might enjoy. And I didn't, not a big Kevin Bacon groupie or anything. I mean, my last big star crush was Tyrone Power. But, sad, isn't it? I picked it up and I took it and I went right out and bought one when I saw it. That's how good it was. Yeah,
it's an excellent film, and the obsession he shows in that is reminiscent of Richard Dreyfuss's obsession in Close Encounters.
Yes, he becomes obsessed, and there's nothing he can do about it. It's like an itch that won't go away. Oh, yeah. And that's called The Stir of Echoes. It was made, I guess, about the same time the other one, The Sixth Sense, came out. And if you guys haven't seen that, you've got to watch that movie. It's wonderful. In some respects, I think it's almost better than The Sixth Sense. But yeah, a lot of movies that are coming out, and I'm glad to see them going back to the books and trying to revive some of the old writers and some of the old stuff, because a lot of kids aren't reading the books anymore. A lot of kids don't even know who Lovecraft was.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I've maintained that there's actually a lot of Lovecraft fans out there, quote-unquote Lovecraft fans, who really either haven't read Lovecraft or tried him and didn't like him. There's so much popular culture out there that people can be familiar with, role-playing games and video games and movies, stuffed toys, plush toys, things like that are related to Lovecraft that people are aware of. And they, like I said, may not have ever read Lovecraft, or maybe read him and just didn't care for him.
He is difficult to read sometimes.
Yeah, he has a very unusual, very florid writing style. A lot of people call it purple prose. I've actually heard a number of people say he's got adjectivitis, where he's just constantly using all these adjectives. And what's funny is when I read through them, I still notice them, but I just don't notice them the way I used to. And I think I wouldn't be surprised if you did some analysis, some computer analysis on his stories. You'd probably find out he doesn't use any more adjectives than anyone else does. He just uses unusual ones that are very conspicuous. So when he uses words like eldritch and gibbous and squamous and things like that, you don't know what you're reading the first time. You've got to stand there with you got to have an encyclopedia or dictionary on standby to understand what he's talking about. So I think it's not so much that he uses any more adjectives than any other author. He just uses unusual ones that really stand out.
Well, you know who I think is a prime candidate for having used Lovecraft for a mentor is Stephen King, because he can spend a whole chapter on a cup of coffee. He drives you nuts with it. I mean, I know people that say, I know it was a good story, I just couldn't take anymore.
Yeah, Stephen King has mentioned on numerous occasions that Lovecraft is one of his primary influences. I think their styles are considerably different. Lovecraft, people, like you just said, people say that Lovecraft can be kind of wordy. I think King is far, far more wordy than Lovecraft is. Like you said, he can spend a couple pages on a cup of coffee or something like that.
Yeah.
But King has definitely written some Lovecraft-themed stories. I'm trying to remember Jerusalem's Lot, not Salem's Lot, but another short story called Jerusalem's Lot was a overtly Lovecraftian story. And The Mist is supposedly strongly influenced by Lovecraft.
The Mist. What one is that? With Adrian, whatever?
Let's see. Oh, no.
Okay. My Lovecraft expert over here, he's telling me.
Oh, you're thinking of The Fog?
Yeah, I was thinking of The Fog. Sorry.
Yeah. The Mist was. They actually did make it into a movie a few years back here, like maybe half a dozen years back. But The Mist is about a grocery store in Maine that's beset with this mist, and out of this mist comes these, scary monsters, and that I fear is one of Lovecraft's legacies of sorts, is that people see him as being the guy who wrote the story about the scary monsters with tentacles. And, you do a search through Lovecraft's text and you will find the word tentacles a number of times. But as a Lovecraft scholar I know once said, you come for the monsters, but you stay for the ideas. Because Lovecraft didn't just write stories about monsters. He wrote stories about our place in the universe and about the loss of identity and things of that nature.
I'm almost hesitant to say this, but his use of making up kind of words or finding unusual words just reminds me of Alice in Wonderland, Alice Through the Looking Glass, Carol also kind of found unusual words when they're singing the songs, and the mopeds, don't step on the mopeds, and things like that. So I don't know, he was before Lovecraft, so maybe Lovecraft was influenced by him as well.
Yeah, I don't recall Lovecraft really talking about Lewis much. It wouldn't surprise me if he had read Alice in Wonderland or Through the Looking Glass. I do remember quite well Jabberwocky, for example, the poem, and all the made-up and portmanteau words in that. But I think the Lovecraft's goal in creating these other entities and strange words and so on, the strange languages, was really to make them seem as alien as possible. Because one of his complaints about a lot of the pulps in his day was that the beings on other worlds in science fiction stories were so human. You get in a spacecraft and you fly to Mars, and what do you know? They're humanoids, and they have human weaknesses just like we do, and they love and they hate, and they might as well be humans on this other planet.
And they look like Anne Francis in that one movie where she's up there with her father, and they're all beautiful. Planet. Yeah, Forbidden Planet.
Which is, I think, based on The Tempest, if I'm not mistaken. I can't recall now. But, Lovecraft tried to make his creatures as alien as possible and tried not to imbue them with any human emotions or motivations.
And you're not an English teacher, right?
No, not at all. As a matter of fact, it's funny. My interests, my work, the work I did before I retired, I was a database analyst and web page developer, and so my work and my avocation, my vocation and avocation are about as far apart as can be. I've been on a number of panels at conferences and conventions talking about Lovecraft, and yeah, I'm completely different from the usual crowd where my background isn't in literature.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about your specific interest in it as soon as we come back from commercial. We're going to commercial, and let me look so I know what we're going to be playing. We're going to be doing a thing from Dark Adventure Radio, and then the commercials are commercials and Dark Adventure Radio, and we'll be right back. And we're talking about Lovecraft tonight, and a lot of people think a lot of the great monster stories and stuff that we have now, a lot of movies are based on a lot of his writings, but if you've never read his writings, you might want to start to get into it. He was a poet. He also wrote short stories. So we'll be right back, and this is GameCon Radio. Well, it's not anymore. It's GCR, Progressive Internet Radio. We'll be right back.
Just a reminder, guys, all our talk show hosts here at GameCon Radio volunteer their time, but you can always show your appreciation. Click on the tip jar and give them a little love. I'm sure maybe your predictions will come out a little bit better. And that's how we roll here at GameCon Radio. We rock your game and your paranormal.
Yes? Hi, I'm here for the New York Ghost Tour. Sorry, we're closed. But you can come back next week. Next week? Forget that. I'll just go check out another place. Trust me, there's no place half as interesting as ours, dear. That's so not true. What about the Shanley Hotel in Napanock? Once you've been to one haunted hotel, you've been to them all. Not like this place. The Shanley Hotel dates back to 1845, and since then it's been a hotspot for paranormal activity. Mysterious music, smells, whistling, doors opening, footsteps, almost everything you can imagine has been experienced at that hotel. It's open to the public? Absolutely. Sal and Cindy, the owners of the hotel, welcome people for regular stays or investigations, and their rates are beyond reasonable. They even offer workshops and in-house psychics. How did you learn about this place? By visiting www.shanleyhotel.com. You can get history, investigation info, and much more. Thanks, I think I will. Just don't tell any of our customers. Your secret's safe with me. It's not like anyone can hear us.
Adventure and the mysterious occult. This is Dark Adventure Radio Theater. Today's episode, HP Lovecrafts, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward.
Was Charlie a good student, Mr. Ward?
Absolutely. He fancied himself an antiquarian even as a child. What have you got there, lad?
The Genealogical Society had more documents that refer to Joseph Kerwin.
Oh, your mother's great...
He fled the witch trials in Salem for the safety of Providence.
He's in league with the devil.
Abigail.
He's unholy.
I swear to ye, John Brown, I shall not rest until that devil Joseph Kerwin rots in hell!
By 1760, Joseph Kerwin was virtually an outcast, widely suspected of vague horrors and demonic alliances.
Damn ye and your equivocations! Is there not a man among ye who thinks not Kerwin is a menace to this town? Ah, there is a time for men to take action, and gentlemen, that day has come!
The columns of raiders divided as they approached Kerwin's farm. Many a shot were fired indoors, and then a flaming thing burst into sight at a point where the Kerwin farm ought to lie.
Charles' research led him to an unfinished manuscript by Hutchinson. He had a photostatic copy made and began to work on decoding the cipher.
And of the seed of old shall one be born who shall look back, though not knowing what he seeks. It's right in here, Mother. You'd never have known it was there. It was completely painted over.
It's uncanny. Charles, he's... you.
What did you find there, sir?
It's my great-great-great-grandfather's journal and papers.
Theodore, I'm concerned about Charles. I think this Kerwin obsession will be the death of him.
Are you seeing improvements in his condition, Dr. Wade?
No. He's rather irritable, and of course he clings to this new antiquarian personality.
Charles! Charles, are you all right?
I have brought to light a monstrous abnormality, but I did it for the sake of knowledge. Now, for the sake of all life and nature, you must help me thrust it back into the dark again.
We're concerned about how you're feeling, Charles.
As well ye should be, Dr. Wade. For surely my memory and balance stand sore afflicted from somewhat close application of my abstruse studies.
There was a quote from Barillas, where he wrote of preparing from even the most antique remains certain essential salts from which the shade of a long dead living thing might be raised up. Maybe they've perfected the process.
Good Lord.
I'm certain there must be some kind of vast crypt beneath the bungalow. Having found Charles' new study, I was convinced I would find his new laboratory as well. My head reeled from the stench. I turned my torch upon the dark opening. It was the top of a brick-faced well. I shone the torch down into the blackness. I wished to God I had not. A cold wind seemed to swirl around me, and the bright lamp sputtered. A terrible stench, smoke, and the bowl on the floor produced a greenish-black vapor in huge volume. All I could think of was that horrid warning, do not call up any that you cannot put down. God in heaven!
Are we on? Welcome back to Mo Banshee's Lair, Visionary Talk Radio on GCR Progressive Internet Radio. I always tell my listeners, I wish you could hear what's going on during the breaks because we don't hear the music. And then we get off on a tangent. And we were talking about art, Lovecraft influenced art. There's a lot of artists that base their creations on his writings, right?
Yeah, actually on the Lovecraft archive at hplovecraft.com, I've got a popular culture section. I've got a Lovecraftian art page that links to a number of different artists that have used Lovecraft as their inspiration for their art. And I remember some of the books I first read were a couple of paperbacks that featured artwork on the cover by Rowena Morrill. One I think was of Wilbur Whately from the Dunwich Horror, and another one was of the Great Race of Yith from The Shadow Out of Time. And I remember really liking those images on the covers. She was Rowena Morrill was primarily a fantasy artist. Mm-hmm. But there's a number of other artists on there that I mentioned on the site. Dave Carson and Alan Kozowski do some black and white art, and they're known for doing a lot of Lovecraft art. H.R. Giger is also claims to be very Lovecraft influenced. He even put out a book called The Necronomicon that was a collection of his artwork named after Lovecraft's book his fictional book that he created. The more I read about Giger's from Giger about his influence, about Lovecraft's influence on him, the less I think Lovecraft really influenced him. I don't think Giger knows as much about Lovecraft as he claims he does, but I do find his art interesting.
Yeah, Matt had asked about Michael Whelan. I want to bring that up and look at that. These are beautiful. Some of them are just, it's like kind of like, what is that movie where they did the new one where they take those guys and they put them in the Avatar. A lot of these are like so spectacular like that, you know. It's just incredible artwork, you know, and I would have never guessed it was, you know, inspired by Lovecraft. I kind of would look at it and think, oh my God, they were on an acid trip.
Yeah, Michael Ellen did some covers for some Ballantine books of Lovecraft's. My goodness, I guess it was back in the late 80s probably, and they wanted him to do a whole series of covers for about half a dozen books, but they couldn't afford for him to do that. So what they ended up having to do is paint this one large panel, and then on the best of book, that was the larger of the set, they just wrapped the panel around the whole book. And then for the individual books, and like I said, there's about half a dozen of those, they just took elements of this panel and included them on the covers. So instead of making separate paintings for each, they just made one big painting and chopped it up for the covers. And what's funny is if you look at these, at the wraparound on the cover, you're looking at it thinking, what's this got to do with Lovecraft? And that's pretty typical of book covers. They've got nothing whatsoever to do with Lovecraft. I think there's one scene pictured on the covers that shows a pile of skulls with some rats on it, and maybe that's the rats in the walls. But beyond that, there's no real Lovecraft influence on the cover.
I will right up front tell everybody I am not a Lovecraft expert. I'm more a Sherlock Holmes. I'm not that. It's not my book of choice for sleeping. I have my own little issues. I don't need that too. But his stories are very in depth. And let me ask you, how much do you think he thought out these stories before he put it to pen? How do you think he came up with some of this stuff? Because you've read it all, right?
Yeah, many of them had long geneses. That would sometimes take years. Sometimes several of his stories were the results of dreams, where he would literally have a dream one night and write up a story the next day. The Statement of Randolph Carter was one story that came to him in a dream. Another story, Nyarlathotep Hotep, came to him in a dream as well. And so that's where some of the ideas for some of these stories came from. It's interesting reading his letters, too, because sometimes he'll recount some of these dreams in the letters that he never wrote into stories. And so some of his letters are like mini stories. So that was where he came up with some of these ideas, but also a lot of this goes back to his childhood. When he was growing up in his grandfather's house, because his father was institutionalized when he was very young, growing up in his maternal grandfather's house, he had a very large library there. And he read a lot of the classics, and he was really smitten by the Arabian Nights. He read a lot of Sherlock Holmes when he was a kid, too, just to bring that back up. In fact, when he first started writing as a kid, like when he was 7 years old, he was writing mystery stories, and probably influenced by dime novels as well. And then it was a few years later before he discovered Poe, and then he focused on writing horror stories. And later encountered Lord Dunsany, who wrote fantasy stories, and then Lovecraft started imitating that as well. In fact, he kind of started writing Dunsanian fantasies before he even discovered Dunsany, and it was just kind of a strange coincidence that they wrote so similarly. And it was a while before, probably the mid-20s, before Lovecraft really started finding his own voice. He even lamented once, here are my Poe stories and here are my Dunsany stories, but where are my Lovecraft stories? And so it was really in the 1920s when he found his own voice and started writing those stories that he's best known for now.
Yeah, I'm sorry, it just came out. Everybody, I'm sick. You know how that goes. Anybody who listens to my show knows that the Banshee, she's got some health issues, and that's okay. I'm cool with it. We were talking about the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and how that was during the break, and how I liked it because it's introducing young people into historic legends in books, H.G. Wells and John Carter and all of this stuff, the Captain Nemo and all that. And I was really, really thrilled to do that. But this guy, he's even inspired video games and stuff, right?
Oh yeah, video games, board games, role-playing games, movies, TV shows, artwork, other authors. There's an entire series of authors that write in what's called the Cthulhu mythos, stories that are set in Lovecraft's fictional universe. So there's the influence he's had are tremendous, and sometimes they're very subtle. Guillermo del Toro's Hellboy film. There's a couple Lovecraft influences, little Lovecraft nods in there. One of them you even have to, step frame by frame through the video to spot it. So his influence has been felt very wide.
What is that movie where the chick goes to that town that's on fire, and it's a movie and a video game now and everything?
Silent Hill.
Silent Hill.
Yeah.
That's kind of similar to his writings with, going and all this other stuff that's going on and nobody even knows it, It's like encased in its own little area and then somebody trips over it. Would you say that was similar to it, his writings?
There's, it's funny, I was never really that familiar with the video games and so on, the Silent Hill games, but I did actually see the film, and there's some fascinating imagery in there that I do get kind of a Lovecraftian vibe from it. There's nothing overt, but that's kind of true of, you could almost say that film probably has some influences with Clive Barker. There's a kind of a Hellraiser feel to Silent Hill as well. So Lovecraft probably did have some influence. I mean, it's everywhere. I mean, it's even in the Batman comic books. There's the Arkham Asylum in the Batman books.
Yeah, it's very similar, yeah.
So it's, that influence is remarkably widespread.
There's been 2 plays based on him.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what they are now. I mentioned them on my website.
Follies and Night Gaunts.
Yeah, Night Gaunts is a story. I think it was Brett Rutherford wrote that, and he lives in Providence, and he wrote a play based on Lovecraft's life. Lovecraft's Follies was, I think, written by James Cheville, and it's not as Lovecraftian. It's just got some Lovecraft elements in it, and that was actually published as a book, as a hardback book even, the play was. So there's a remarkably wide number of things that Lovecraft has influenced. It's pretty much everywhere. If someone has written any horror fiction in the last 90 years, there's probably some Lovecraft influence in it.
Okay. Some authors, it appears, mixes Sherlock Holmes type stories with Lovecraft themes, and I have to think it's because you got 2 winners there,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's I think there was a collection called Shadows Over Baker Street that was Lovecraftian Holmes stories. So they were I think they were essentially Sherlock Holmes stories with Lovecraftian themes to them. A lot of this kind of fiction I don't read myself. Just studying Lovecraft keeps me busy. But yeah, there's a whole world of Lovecraftian fiction out there. I actually, when I first discovered Lovecraft, I devoured it just as much as I devoured Lovecraft stuff. But after a while, I started realizing, it just didn't have the gravitas, as it were, that Lovecraft's works do. And so I gave up reading that sort of thing years ago. And I keep plenty busy just with Lovecraft. He's written so many letters, and just going through those is work in itself.
Nightmare Before Christmas, I have to wonder how much, what's his name, the director of that, Tim Burton, was influenced by Lovecraft to make up that whole Nightmare Before Christmas, because that's very, when you look at that with the darkness, and the way that I have to say, I think anybody creative in the genre of occult or dark or that kind of thing, they have to have read Lovecraft. I mean, it's there. It may not be full blown, but it's there. You can see his hand in a lot of creative stuff, right?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd say, I haven't seen anything in Tim Burton's work that I would say was probably Lovecraft influenced. And keep in mind that when you say the occult influence there, that sort of thing, like just to use Nightmare Before Christmas, for example, there's a lot of traditional Halloween elements in that all, kind of shoved together in one place. And occult themes that you see in other movies and so on, Lovecraft really didn't delve into the occult too much, strangely enough, in his stories, despite the fact that they're horror themed. A lot of times he would talk about occult things in his stories, but reveal in his stories that the real background behind these is something different altogether.
Right.
A good example is The Dreams in the Witch House, that talks about this witch that was executed in Arkham, which is his stand-in for Salem, Massachusetts. And what she had is she really didn't participate in witchcraft. She believed it was witchcraft, but it was actually a form of advanced mathematics. And a student at Miskatonic University in Arkham learns some of the same things that she learns by delving into this advanced math. And the black man, which was the symbol of Satan in the witch cult that she pledges herself to, is just an avatar of Lovecraft's creature Nyarlathotep. So there's always something else behind the occult. So when you see the occult in Lovecraft, it's not the traditional satanic or witchcraft kind of occult that we're accustomed to. There's something more behind it, and people are being tricked into thinking it's traditional witchcraft.
Yeah, I guess it's the beginning of the movie, Nightmare Before Christmas. He's walking, he's in this dimension, and he's walking, and then he stumbles on all the other dimensions, the other holidays, and he steps through and is led on this adventure, and it opens his eyes that there is more. And maybe that's why I kind of associate it a little bit with them. Do you know what I mean? Maybe I'm not being clear, or I'm just being stupid, but yeah, that kind of thing. Geography is your passion with Lovecraft, right?
Yeah, there's quite a few Lovecraft scholars out there, all with their own specialties. Some specialize in Lovecraft's biographical facts, and some in his genealogy, maybe some in specific literary aspects. But the area I specialize in, I call Lovecraftian geography, and that's tracking down points of interest in the real world that inspired Lovecraft's fiction, and not just places he mentions in his fiction, but also places he mentions in his letters. To date, I've tracked down somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,200 points of interest that he mentions in his fiction and letters, mostly letters, and going everywhere from Key West, Florida, all the way up to Quebec. He traveled pretty extensively along the eastern seaboard, and I've probably visited about half of these locations so far, trying to track them down. Some of them are really fascinating, finding places that have that he mentions that have vanished, tracking down photos of them in historical societies and so on. And really, there's this myth that Lovecraft was a real stay-at-home recluse, and there's a certain element of truth to that. Prior to his mother dying in 1921, he was to a great extent a recluse, and at that point he was 30 years old. And after that, before that, he had made small local trips up to Boston to meet a fellow amateur journalist. But after that, after his mother died, he really started traveling very widely, like I said, all on the eastern seaboard, also as far west as Cleveland and New Orleans. So he made it to the Mississippi. And the number of places he visited really is astonishing. And so that's been my focus in Lovecraftian researches, has been tracking all these places down.
Well, we want to talk about them because South Amboy or Perth Amboy is in one of them, right?
Yeah, he actually, when he lived in New York City for a couple of years, he would go over to New Jersey. He would take the ferries over, and he took a ferry once to Staten Island, and even then took the ferry from Staten Island over to Perth Amboy.
Mm-hmm. Let's back up a little bit about his life. His father died. People suspect he died of a venereal disease, right?
Yeah, his father worked for the Gorham Silversmith Company. It was a company that made silverware. Not just utensils, but plates and serving trays and things of that nature. And he wasn't a door-to-door salesman. He actually sold wholesale to other companies, but he did travel extensively. And in, I think it was 1893, when Lovecraft was only a couple years old, that his father, Winfield Scott Lovecraft, effectively kind of went crazy in a Chicago hotel room and claimed there were men molesting his wife in the next room. And, of course, his wife was back at home outside of Boston. And so he was basically taken back to Butler Hospital in Providence, where Lovecraft spent most of his life, and died there 5 years later. So,
go ahead.
Oh, and it was due to what they call general paresis, which was code name for tertiary neurosyphilis. So he died from syphilis. He went crazy.
Now, the thing with syphilis, any venereal disease, is if you're having a relationship with your wife, she's going to get it. And so pretty much the same outcome happened to her, too, right?
Kind of. In 1919, she had a nervous breakdown and ended up going to the very same hospital, Butler Hospital, and she died there. But she didn't die from... There was no evidence that she had syphilis. There was no proof that she didn't, but there was no proof.
Yeah, they're not going to say that about a lady, you know.
Right.
Yeah, her old man, you know, gave her VD, you know.
Right. Exactly.
They might say it amongst themselves, but gentlemen and that kind of thing won't say that about a lady who's, you know, let's face it, it's not her fault. Her old man did that to her. But then, you know, while this stuff is taking form, they're crazier than, you know, rats in an outhouse, you know. So this kid, you know, he didn't see his father going, you know, after he had that big thing. But I'm sure there had to be some kind of craziness going on when he did see him. And then, of course, the father's booked away, which means to me nobody go to Butler Hospital, because I think that the life expectancy is like 4 years if you got a VD. So nobody go there, because everybody that went there that I read about died. So, but then the mother is raising him, and she goes to live with her father, who's a man with, you know, wealth. But she had to start acting a little odd if she had it too. You know what I mean? A little bit on the crazy side.
There's, based on Lovecraft's letters and any other evidence we've got, there doesn't seem to be any evidence she had that Winfield had transmitted to Susie. She was peculiar. You know, we'll grant you that. She, you know, was the kind of cloying mother who was overprotective of her son. And she did kind of have a nervous breakdown in like I said, in 1919. She actually died there in Butler Hospital 2 years later, but it was due to a gallbladder operation. She didn't recover from it. Probably got an infection as a result and didn't come through that. But then you've got to also wonder, well, if Winfield Scott gave his disease to Susie, was it before Howard himself was born? And there's no evidence of that either.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very tough to tell. It's even, you know, it's hard just to decipher what Winfield Scott Lovecraft himself died of when you look at the medical records.
Yeah, you know, it's just, you wonder what this kid saw in his life that made him write the way he did, you know, and you know, you sit there and say, oh, well, he read a lot of books, but I've read a lot of books too, and I've never written anything out. I've read Lovecraft, and I never, when I was a kid, I've forgotten 99.9% of what I've ever read about him, but I don't write like that, you know, nothing encouraged me, you know, to write like that. So his life, it's kind of like what flipped on that switch. You know, I guess that's what I'm trying, even now after a week of reading this stuff and trying to go through what put that little light bulb on. And he started writing, because he has three very distinctive writing styles. Like 10 years, he imitates almost Poe, and then another 10 years, and then his last 10 years, it seems, he came into his own and became his own person, right?
Right, yeah, and he really discovered Poe about the same time as his father died. And so, you know, like I said before that, he was reading a lot of the classics, and things like the Arabian Nights, which really struck his fancy. So it was about the same time his father died that he discovered Poe. Is there a connection there? He definitely saw a lot of grief in his life with, you know, his father dying when he was probably about 7, and then his grandfather dying when he was 13, and then his mother dying when he was 28. So, you know, he saw a lot of this. You know, he felt a lot of loss in the first 30 years of his life.
But not much more than other people in that time frame did, because people died. You know, we're not accustomed to that kind of life anymore. And again, it's talking about looking back at that time period. You know, we sit there and say, oh my God, they died just from a VD. You know, you go to the doctor and you get put on stuff and you never get sick again. But things were different back then. People died having babies. It was a different world back then, and they were used to death. It wasn't a big lurking thing that kids weren't afraid to walk up to a corpse that was laid out and maybe hold its hand or pet. When I was a kid, you know, your grandmother you loved more than anything on earth, you would go up and just stroke her hair. Now kids are scared to death of death. There's a lot of kids that never ever deal with death. That, you know, it's just a different world now. So I guess maybe he just funneled it into writing, which he obviously loved. This kid was reading at the age of 5, Arabian Nights. How smart is this kid?
Well, he was probably reading a little before that, because keep in mind his earliest known writings were when he was 7. So I believe he claims to have been reading as early as 3. So he was reading at an astonishing early age. He did go through a period of some depression. He even talks about having contemplated suicide, and he claims to have carried a vial of poison with him. And then suddenly he seems to have completely gotten over it and seems to have been pretty well adjusted for the remainder of his life.
Let me ask you something. A lot of his letters, not all of them, but a good portion of them have survived. How did that happen? Because he wasn't that big to the general public. How was all of this saved?
Well, I think a lot of it was saved because it was so fascinating. You know, he didn't write letters like, I went to the store today and I bought a can of beans and, that sort of thing, really boring everyday stuff. He wrote letters about philosophy and arts and architecture and history and politics and things like this. It's estimated, the numbers keep changing, but it's estimated that he probably wrote about 80,000 letters in his lifetime, only about 8,000 of which probably exist, but the longest of which went to 70 pages.
Wow.
And some have said he had a frontal lobe disorder called hypergraphia, where he was just compelled to write. So he wrote a tremendous amount of letters in his lifetime. He's probably in the top 10 most prolific letter writers. There was other people who might have written more letters, but they were probably not a fraction as substantive as Lovecraft's letters are. They're really fascinating to read. I find myself doing my geographical research, and I'll be searching through his letters. We have a big electronic archive of them, and I'll find some tidbit about some place he went to, and I'll start reading about it, and I'll just keep reading, and it's really hard to stop because they're just so fascinating to read.
Yeah, and I can get on board with that. We're going to go to break because we're almost overshooting it, and but when I need to get something across, when I need to get my idea across, and someone, when you're face to face with that person, you've got to get past that barrier, that little invisible wall that everybody has. And sometimes when you're face to face, you can't do that because they're on the offensive. But when you write it in a letter, and you're putting down your thoughts and your opinions, there's nobody screaming back at you, you're wrong. And I find I can do that much better than standing in front of you where I want to say, you feckin' idiot, will you stop and listen to me, and because that's rude. A lot of people don't like to hear that. Did I lose you?
Oh, no, I'm here.
Oh, okay. Okay. But I'm the only one allowed to drop dead on this show. But you know what I mean? So I can understand that, he wrote a lot of letters because it seems to me he wasn't horribly shy, but it seems like that was his way of navigating and getting his point across.
My suspicion is in in normal social situations where he didn't know people, he probably was very shy and reserved. But around people he knew well, he was perfectly comfortable.
We'll be right back because he even recorded his diet, which speaks volumes, and we're going to talk about that when we come back. And let me see. I've got to bring it up so I know what the we're going to be playing. I think what is that? The 30 fungi. Yeah, that's the next one. We're coming from Yuggoth. So we're going to be playing that, and we'll be right back. We're talking about Lovecraft and his incredible legacy that I don't think he ever really realized he left. We'll be right back.
You are listening to GameCon Radio.
This is Michelle Tomlinson, the Scream Queen, and I listen to GameCon Radio. Why? Because it rocks!
Background. I never can be tied to raw, new things, for I first saw the light in an old town, where from my window huddled roofs sloped down to a quaint harbor rich with visionings. Streets with carved doorways where the sunset beams flooded old fan lights and small window panes, and Georgian steeples topped with gilded vanes. These were the sights that shaped my childhood dreams. Such treasures, left from times of cautious leaven, cannot but loose the hold of flimsier wraiths that flit with shifting ways and muddled faiths across the changeless walls of earth and heaven. They cut the moment's thongs and leave me free to stand alone before eternity.
Welcome back to Mo Banshee's Lair, and our guest tonight is Donovan Loucks, and he has a site called HPLovecraft.com, and you're going to find everything. This is a comprehensive site, people. Under his popular culture, you click that, you find movies that were influenced by his writings, games, music, art, comics, plays, dramatizations. I mean, and you go to his study, Lovecraft events. There's all kinds of things on this site that are just amazing. And when you go and look at some of the art that's been influenced by him, you know, you got to take it into your own opinion if you think it was really Lovecraft or, you know, what it is. But this is a great site. If you love Lovecraft, you're going to love this. I was just asking Donovan where the bulk of his writings and that were from at, and you said some of them were in Wisconsin.
Yeah, after Lovecraft's death, a couple of his correspondents, August Derleth and Donald Wandry, decided to start a publishing house, Arkham House, to keep Lovecraft stories alive and in print. And so they founded Arkham House, and they also invited a lot of Lovecraft's old correspondents to send them letters from Lovecraft, which they had kept because they were just so fascinating. And so many of these letters got sent to Arkham House, and they transcribed them, and they published 5 volumes of the selected letters. And many of those showed up at the Wisconsin Historical Society. The bulk of Lovecraft's manuscripts, though, are at the John Hay Library at Brown University. And that was due in part to Robert H. Barlow, one of Lovecraft's correspondents and friends who lived down in Florida, and he visited Barlow on numerous occasions. So there's most of the manuscripts are there at the John Hay Library, and I consult them frequently on my trips there. I live in Minnesota currently, but I'm in the process of moving to Providence. And on trips, I go out there and consult them, help other Lovecraft scholars with researches and so on. And it's fascinating stuff to go through.
Yeah, well, when you get over, you got to let me know. Maybe we can hook up, and talk more. But your geography, let's talk about some of the places that you visited and what their Lovecraft, connection is.
Okay. Yeah, we could do a 2-hour show just on that.
Yeah, I know. We just said that. We haven't even touched the geography, which is your speciality, and that's the way it goes, But we've got a good 40 minutes, so let's see.
Well, on my website, on the HP Lovecraft Archive, I've got a couple of pages on Lovecraftian geography, and it just introduces you to some of the real-world locations that are featured in Lovecraft's stories, as well as a few points of interest that bear on Lovecraft's life, like some of the homes he lived in and his gravesite and that sort of thing. And so I've also got a walking tour. If you ever find yourself in Providence and want to see most of the Lovecraft sites, I've got a walking tour map there. You can just download it and print it out, take it with you, and see most of the sites in Providence that are related to Lovecraft. Like I said, my specialty is geographical research, and I was inspired by a book published back in 1977 called the HP Lovecraft Companion by a fellow named Philip Schreffler. And in that book, Schreffler looks at some of the points of interest, the real-world points of interest that inspired Lovecraft. And that's really what got me going down this road, because I realized pretty quickly that there was a lot more than Schreffler had led on to. There was just a tremendous number of places. It's hard to go any place in Providence that Lovecraft didn't visit, it seems. So that's been my focus, is rooting these places out. One of the discoveries I've made fairly recently, just within the last year, has been the home of Joseph Kerwin, who's the main antagonist in the case of Charles Dexter Ward. Lovecraft describes the location of his home in Providence, in colonial Providence. And for years, we always had a good idea of where it was, but there was no telling if Lovecraft had just made up the house that was there, because there's no house there currently. So did Lovecraft make up a house? Was it a real house? Why did he choose it? That sort of thing. So eventually I found some old plat maps, discovered there really was a house at that location. The location was 6 Olney Street in Providence. And the next thing I wondered is, why did Lovecraft pick this house of all places? And so I looked through some old city directories and discovered there was a woman there named Delilah Townsend. And that name rang a bell, but I couldn't place it at first. So I searched through Lovecraft's letters, and it turns out that was a woman who had done housework for Lovecraft and his aunts. So he had incorporated her home into the story. In addition, this woman, Delilah Townsend, that had done work for him and his aunts, was a black woman who had a husband that lived with her at one point. They broke up later. They were divorced. And in the story, the case of Charles Dexter Ward, there's a couple named Asa and Hannah that live in the house, another black couple. So there was all these in-jokes that Lovecraft put into the story that, honestly, I don't even know if anybody outside of him and his aunts would have gotten. And so Lovecraft stories are filled with these kinds of little in-jokes.
Yeah, well, I think it's only natural that somebody is going to incorporate, things from their life as ideas and stuff, Even Anne Rice will admit that, going through the grieving process of her daughter and everything inspired her to write too. And instead of it being cancer, it's a vampire that slowly steals your life away, Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of, that's taking a memory and using it for the greater good, I would suppose. We have a call number if people want to call in, but you have to give us enough time for the text to pick up. And if somebody doesn't answer right away, then, just wait and we'll tell you to call back, because, we're doing the best we can with picking up calls and then filtering them into the station, which is in Missouri, and I'm not. But the number is 732-707-7709, and I'll say it one more time, and it's also in the chat room on the main page of gcrinternetradio.com. It's 732-707-7709. Did it look to you? Let me ask you. You were looking at the geography. I envision your back wall or something with this map and little red pins where you're tracing the geography. Did you find like a pattern of how he went places and traveled?
Not really. He lived in Providence most of his life. I mean, he was born there in 1890. He died there in 1937 and is buried there. There were only, I think, about 4 years he lived outside of that period. When he was very young, when he was a child, he and his parents lived outside Boston. And then in 1924, 5, and 6, when he married and moved to New York City and lived in Brooklyn. So beyond that, he lived in Providence his whole life. So the only pattern you see is that all the push pins are close to Providence. And regarding that push pin map, I actually use tools like Streets and Trips and Microsoft Map Point to keep this massive database full of push pins in it. I'm slowly but surely working on a book, maybe two, describing all these points of interest using quotes from Lovecraft's letters and stories and so on.
You got to come back when it's ready to be published and everything. So give us another place that he infuses into his books.
Well, another interesting place is the town of Newburyport, Massachusetts. In Lovecraft's story, The Shadow over Innsmouth, the narrator starts out in the town of Newburyport and takes this bus to the shadowed town of Innsmouth. And many of the places the Lovecraft mentions in The Shadow over Innsmouth that are in Newburyport are still there, with a couple of exceptions, like the library where the narrator goes to do research. The library is still there. The lunch counter, the Ideal Lunch where the narrator goes, is still there. It's a shoe store now. There was a pharmacy, a drugstore that was in the story. That's still there, but it's a Bank of America. So all these, many of these places are still there. One exception is the YMCA, which burned down actually back in the 80s. And the library's built an extension, an annex onto that. The one that I found the most interesting was that in Schruffler's book, the HP Lovecraft Companion, he mentions the Newburyport Historical Society, which is, Lovecraft mentions that in the story, and there is no such place as the Newburyport Historical Society. It's actually called the Historical Society of Old Newbury. But it's currently housed in the Caleb Cushing House. Well, in Lovecraft's time, it was in the Pettingill Fowler House, about a half a mile away. So that's an example of one of the errors that has been made over the years in Lovecraftian geography, is that people have looked at today's topography or today's geography and said, okay, here's what Lovecraft had in mind. Well, in fact, that place wasn't there in Lovecraft's time, or the building may have moved. The house that Lovecraft lived in the last 3-4 years of his life actually got moved in the 50s. So you got to look at the time that that Lovecraft lived in. You got to look at the right architecture. Many errors have been made in Lovecraftian geography with people identifying houses that simply have the wrong architecture. Or they don't take Lovecraft at face value. Lovecraft says repeatedly in his letters that Innsmouth is a considerably twisted version of the town of Newburyport. And so people will look at other cities like the town of Gloucester, Massachusetts, and say, oh, well, this is Innsmouth. Well, no, Lovecraft says in his letters time and time again that Newburyport is Innsmouth. So there's a lot of errors have been made in this area, and that's one of the things I hope to clear up, is correcting the errors that have been made in Lovecraftian geography.
Let me ask you, because when you say Newbury, the five and dime always comes up into my head. The Newbury, maybe he's having everybody on with a great laugh and saying it was the Newbury building. And you remember them. They wore the five and dime. That was the place you went, Newbury's. Do you find he likes to have people on in his writing?
No, actually, he's incredibly honest in his letters about his inspirations. And And he did visit Newburyport on a couple of occasions. I think first time was in 1923, and then he visited again in 1931. And so it's clear from his letters when he talks about Newburyport, it's clear that was his inspiration. There's the only instances we've found ever in his letters where he, as you put it, led someone on was about his high school education. He never did graduate high school, and for that reason never went on to Brown University. He wanted to go into astronomy, and he just couldn't cut the math. And he didn't make it through his senior year at high school, at Hope High School. And in a couple of letters, he just flat out lies about that.
I have a question in one of the chatters is asking in a side window. Providence is Rhode Island. Providence, Rhode Island is where he was born.
Correct.
And he lived most of his life in there. He did marry a lady who was 10 years older than him. And she moved him to New York. She seemed to be as outgoing as he was reserved. And he was, from anything I could tell, absolutely miserable in New York City. And I can understand that because when I have to go into Broadway to watch a play, I mean, yeah, Angela Lansbury's wonderful, but I'm miserable in New York City. So I can understand that. It's a very busy place. It's not Providence, Rhode Island, you know?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Lovecraft's mother died in 1921, and within 2 months, he had met his wife. And then 3 years later, they pretty much eloped to New York City, and he moved in her apartment in Brooklyn and stayed there for a couple of years. And at first, I think he was really fascinated by the opportunities that New York provided. And he had a number of friends that lived there because he had visited New York prior to that. But he didn't find a job, didn't make that much effort to find a job, but he was also always quite the xenophobe. He didn't like foreigners whatsoever, and he says a lot of really filthy racist things in his letters. There's several racist things in his stories, for that matter. And New York City, the melting pot that it was simply not something that appealed to him. With all its modern skyscrapers and its foreigners and so on, it didn't. It wasn't the small town that he was accustomed to in Providence, with where most of the people were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants.
In the chat, Elf Queen says Providence is pretty. She likes it, and I said, yeah, it's quiet. And Anita says, yep, we must be tired. I was talking about Providence, but yes, it might be tired too. And our guest is Donovan Loucks. And he's got I just want to keep plugging your site, HP Lovecraft.com, and we're talking about Lovecraft. And the marriage kind of she separated, and it kind of just limped along, and then finally they parted ways. When we talk about him, you talk about him with writers, and he had a lot of associates and friends. These guys back then used to belong to clubs and groups where writers would correspond with each other. And they maybe never met in person either, but they had this lifelong correspondence thing going. And that's, in a way, you can kind of understand it if you go to Facebook, the social network. You might have a friend. I mean, my site has attracted people since 1998, and I've watched people grow up and start their own families, and I've never met them. But I know everything about them, and that's kind of how it was back then, only it was all done through the post. And you might have to wait 3 months for an answer to a letter. But they did find other people interested in this writing like themselves, right?
Yeah, back in, I think it was 1904, Lovecraft had started writing letters to some of the Argosy magazines. There was a certain writer who was very popular, and people would write these gushing letters to the editor about how great he was, and Lovecraft thought he was horrible. So he basically wrote a letter to the editor saying that in polite terms, and they got into a real fight over that, writing letters back and forth from month to month. And a fellow that was in the amateur journalist movement, Edward Doss, I believe his name was, invited Lovecraft to join the amateur journal movement. And what the amateur journalism movement was groups of people who would write and then collect their poems or stories or articles into self-published newspapers that they might even typeset themselves and then distribute them among their friends. And there were two main ones, the National Amateur Press Association and the United Amateur Press Association. And at one point, Lovecraft actually was a member of both, even though they were considered rival organizations, and ascended to the presidency in at least one, maybe even both, I can't recall now. But he was very involved with that and met quite a few other authors as a result of that. But he also came into correspondence with other authors outside of the amateur journalism movement, like Robert E. Howard of Conan the Barbarian fame. They corresponded and never met. There was even one point where I think Lovecraft was going to New Orleans and Robert E. Howard lived in Texas, and there was talk of them visiting each other. They're meeting up in New Orleans, but that didn't happen. So Lovecraft also was in correspondence with Bob Bloch, who wrote Psycho. And so he had a pretty wide list of correspondence that he influenced considerably.
Yeah, he had a short life, and you've mentioned that a couple of times. He was born August 20th, 1890, and he died in 1937. If he had lived, let's say, to be 80, if he had lived, he would have been alive in the 80s, and more people would have been more aware of his writings, because, he would have kept writing and stuff. Or maybe it would have backlashed and he would have fallen on his face. I'm not sure. But he did die so young. And, where was he when he died? He died at home. What was his death?
He actually died in the hospital in Rhode Island Hospital, the Jane Brown, what is now the Jane Brown wing of Rhode Island Hospital. And he died on March 15th, the Ides of March, the anniversary of which is just 10 days from now. And he died of what was called Bright's disease, which was really a kind of intestinal cancer. And it's believed that may have been brought on by his horrible diet. Even though his grandfather was a pretty wealthy man, like I said earlier, he died in 1904, 33 years before Lovecraft died. And the family money had run out. Whipple Van Buren Phillips, his maternal grandfather, had some investments that just didn't go well. There was a dam project out in Idaho that he was financing, and the dam broke. And so a lot of the monies that Whipple Phillips had kind of petered out at that point, and he didn't leave that much behind to his family. And then, of course, the family that was left behind was Lovecraft's mother and her two sisters, so Lovecraft's aunts, and one of them married and her husband died. The other one married and she divorced her husband. So pretty much it was Lovecraft, his mother, and these two aunts. And so he was the breadwinner, and he really didn't make much money writing stories. And he charged far too little for his revision work that he did for people as well. And so without much money, he wasn't eating well at all. And in his letters, he describes how thrifty he was at buying, a can of beans and stretching it over multiple meals, and buying cheese and crackers and things like this, and drinking coffee. And you don't see any vegetables in his diet. And he loved his sugar. He loved donuts. He just had a horrible, horrible diet. And there was one point where he even talks about having moved from his house at 10 Barn Street to the house at 66 College Street, the final home he lived in. And going through the pantry, he discovered some cocoa that apparently they had bought when they were at the other home, and the cocoa had moved with them. They had brought it with them and just stuck it in the pantry. And he said it was a little musty smelling, but he ate it anyway. And when he says he ate it, he doesn't mean he put it in hot water and drank it. He just scooped it out and ate cocoa. So his diet was just terrible. So on March 10th, 1937, he'd been in pain for at least a month with abdominal pain. He went into the hospital, and the doctors pretty much said, sorry, there's nothing we can do at this point but give you morphine. It's terminal. And 5 days later, he died.
When I look at pictures of him, I because I just did a show on this too and all, but I'm reminded of Abraham Lincoln. Physically, very, very tall, very gaunt, almost comically. When you look at them, and I look at him and think, I wonder if he had Morphin disease or syndrome, when I look at him, because physically, when he's a kid and a young man, he's very attractive. He's got a soft face and he's pretty handsome, but as he gets older, you see the shoulders kind of going down, and we know he had a lousy diet and all. We need to go to break. We're at 10:30, and let me bring up the music so that the last piece we're going to play is like 11 minutes long. So let me just postpone the break and explain what it is. At the Mountains of Madness, it's chapter 7, and it's read by William Hart. And the reason I'm playing this is I want the listeners to get a feel for the way he wrote, by somebody reading it, and hear words the way he wrote them and all, and not interpreted them. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Yes. So I really wanted people to get an idea of the way he wrote, and it's an odd way to do it. And we're going to bring Donovan back and talk about his site again and everything. It's hplovecraft.com. So we will be coming back. But yeah, the more I look at his face, and I think, God, he reminds me of Lincoln, and they thought Lincoln had Morphin syndrome, so maybe that also played. But he was very obsessive. He wrote down everything he ate, right?
Not everything, but yeah, in his later years, he would economize, and he would make a list of all his meals for the week and that sort of thing, mainly to kind of show off his thriftiness, and yet really it shows off his bad diet.
Mm-hmm. You know who else did that, and it has nothing to do with this, but Jonathan Frid, when he used to be Barnabas Collins in Dark Shadows in the 60s. When he moved back to New York after his brother died, he moved back and the series was over, so he could be near his nephews and everything to help the family out and all. They found ledgers full of what he ate every day because he knew the TV put 15 pounds on him. And they said he was anal about it. When they went through the ledgers, they were like, how could you possibly stand there day after day after day and count calories and watch every little thing? But again, he also, he wasn't filthy rich. His family, he had some money through the family, and he was trying to make it last. So in a way, maybe he was doing the same thing. But yeah, definitely keeping that kind of ledger and saying, oh my goodness, I managed to get through 2 days on one can of beans it's odd. I gotta tell you, I would be, God almighty, in 2 days I've only had one can of beans, not bragging about it, you know? Yeah, we're going to be right back. Donovan will be right back with us. This is a 11-minute reading of Chapter 7 at the Mountains of Madness. And I hope you guys enjoy it and get a sense for Lovecraft. I hope you pick up some books and read it. You know, it's interesting stuff. We'll be right back.
You are listening to GameCon Radio.
You feel that?
GameCon Radio is who we are, and this is what we do. GameCon Radio, we rock your game.
HP Lovecrafts at the Mountains of Madness. Your reader is William Hart. Chapter 7. The full story so far as deciphered, will shortly appear in an official bulletin of Miskatonic University. Here I shall sketch only the salient highlights in a formless, rambling way. Myth or otherwise, the sculptures told of the coming of those star-headed things to the nascent, lifeless Earth out of cosmic space. Their coming, and the coming of many other alien entities such as at certain times embark upon spatial pioneering. They seemed able to traverse the interstellar ether on their vast, membranous wings, thus oddly confirming some curious hill folklore long ago told me by an antiquarian colleague. They had lived under the sea a good deal, building fantastic cities and fighting terrific battles with nameless adversaries by means of intricate devices employing unknown principles of energy. Evidently, their scientific and mechanical knowledge far surpassed man's today, though they made use of its more widespread and elaborate forms only when obliged to. Some of the sculptures suggested that they had passed through a stage of mechanized life on other planets, but had receded upon finding its effects emotionally unsatisfying. Their preternatural toughness of organization and simplicity of natural wants made them peculiarly able to live on a high plane without the more specialized fruits of artificial manufacture, and even without garments except for occasional protection against the elements. It was under the sea, at first for food and later for other purposes, that they first created Earth life, using available substances according to long-known methods. The more elaborate experiments came after the annihilation of various cosmic enemies. They had done the same thing on other planets, having manufactured not only necessary foods, but certain multicellular protoplasmic masses capable of molding their tissues into all sorts of temporary organs under hypnotic influence and thereby forming ideal slaves to perform the heavy work of the community. These viscous masses were without doubt what Abdul al-Hazred whispered about as the Shoggoths in his frightful Necronomicon, though even that mad Arab had not hinted that any existed on Earth except in the dreams of those who had chewed a certain alkaloidal herb. When the star-headed Old Ones on this planet had synthesized their simple food forms and bred a good supply of Shoggoths, they allowed other cell groups to develop into other forms of animal and vegetable life for sundry purposes, extirpating any whose presence became troublesome. With the aid of the Shoggoths, whose expansions could be made to lift prodigious weights, the small, low cities under the sea grew to vast and imposing labyrinths of stone not unlike those which later rose on land. Indeed, the highly adaptable Old Ones had lived much on land in other parts of the universe, and probably retained many traditions of land construction. As we studied the architecture of all these sculptured Paleogean cities, including that whose eon-dead corridors we were even then traversing, we were impressed by a curious coincidence which we have not yet tried to explain, even to ourselves. The tops of the buildings, which in the actual city around us had of course been weathered into shapeless ruins ages ago, were clearly displayed in the bas-reliefs, and showed vast clusters of needle-like spires, delicate finials on certain cone and pyramid apexes, and tiers of thin, horizontal scalloped discs capping cylindrical shafts. This was exactly what we had seen in that monstrous and portentous mirage, cast by a dead city whence such skyline features had been absent for thousands and tens of thousands of years, which loomed on our ignorant eyes across the unfathomed mountains of madness as we first approached poor Lake's ill-fated camp. Of the life of the Old Ones, both under the sea and after part of them migrated to land, volumes could be written. Those in shallow water had continued the fullest use of the eyes at the ends of their 5 main head tentacles, and had practiced the arts of sculpture and of writing in quite the usual way, the writing accomplished with a stylus on waterproof waxen surfaces. Those lower down in the ocean depths, though they used a curious phosphorescent organism to furnish light, pieced out their vision with obscure special senses operating through the prismatic cilia on their heads, senses which rendered all the Old Ones partly independent of light in emergencies. Their forms of sculpture and writing had changed curiously during the descent, embodying certain apparently chemical coating processes, probably to secure phosphorescence, which the bas-reliefs could not make clear to us. The beings moved in the sea partly by swimming, using the lateral crinoid arms, and partly by wriggling with the lower tier of tentacles containing the pseudofeet. Occasionally they accomplished long swoops with the auxiliary use of 2 or more sets of their fan-like folding wings. On land, they locally used the pseudofeet, but now and then flew at great heights or over long distances with their wings. The many slender tentacles into which the crinoid arms branched were infinitely delicate, flexible, strong, and accurate in muscular nervous coordination, ensuring the utmost skill and dexterity in all artistic and other manual operations. The toughness of the things was almost incredible. Even the terrific pressures of the deepest sea bottoms appeared powerless to harm them. Very few seemed to die at all except by violence, and their burial places were very limited. The fact that they covered their vertically inhumed dead with 5-pointed inscribed mounds set up thoughts in Danforth and me which made a fresh pause and recuperation necessary after the sculptures revealed it. The beings multiplied by means of spores, like vegetable pteridophytes as Lake had suspected, but owing to their prodigious toughness and longevity, and consequent lack of replacement needs, they did not encourage the large-scale development of new prothyli except when they had new regions to colonize. The young matured swiftly and received an education evidently beyond any standard we can imagine. The prevailing intellectual and aesthetic life was highly evolved and produced a tenaciously enduring set of customs and institutions which I shall describe more fully in my coming monograph. These varied slightly according to sea or land residence, but had the same foundations and essentials. Though able, like vegetables, to derive nourishment from inorganic substances, they vastly preferred organic and especially animal food. They ate uncooked marine life under the sea, but cooked their viands on land. They hunted game and raised meat herds, slaughtering with sharp weapons whose odd marks on certain fossil bones our expedition had noted. They resisted all ordinary temperatures marvelously, and in their natural state could live in water down to freezing. When the great chill of the Pleistocene drew on, however, nearly 1 million years ago, the land dwellers had to resort to special measures including artificial heating, until at last the deadly cold appears to have driven them back into the sea. For their prehistoric flights through cosmic space, legend said, they had absorbed certain chemicals and became almost independent of eating, breathing, or heat conditions, but by the time of the great cold they had lost track of the method. In any case, they could not have prolonged the artificial state indefinitely without harm. Being non-pairing and semi-vegetable in structure, the old ones had no biological basis for the family phase of mammal life, but seemed to organize large households on the principles of comfortable space utility and, as we deduce from the pictured occupations and diversions of co-dwellers, congenial mental association. In furnishing their homes, they kept everything in the center of the huge rooms, leaving all the wall spaces free for decorative treatment. Lighting, in the case of the land inhabitants, was accomplished by a device probably electrochemical in nature. Both on land and underwater they used curious tables, chairs, and couches like cylindrical frames, for they rested and slept upright with folded down tentacles, and racks for the hinged sets of dotted surfaces forming their books. Government was evidently complex and probably socialistic, though no certainties in this regard could be deduced from the sculptures we saw. There was extensive commerce, both local and between different cities, certain small, flat counters, 5-pointed and inscribed, serving as money. Probably the smaller of the various greenish soapstones found by our expedition were pieces of such currency. Though the culture was mainly urban, some agriculture and much stock raising existed. Mining and a limited amount of manufacturing were also practiced. Travel was very frequent, but permanent migration seemed relatively rare except for the vast colonizing movements by which the race expanded. For personal locomotion, no external aid was used, since in land, air, and water movement alike, the old ones seemed to possess excessively vast capacities for speed. Loads, however, were drawn by beasts of burden, shoggoths under the sea, and a curious variety of primitive vertebrates in the later years of land existence. These vertebrates, as well as an infinity of other life forms, animal and vegetable, marine, terrestrial, and aerial, were the products of unguided evolution acting on life cells made by the old ones but escaping beyond their radius of attention. They had been suffered to develop unchecked because they had not come in conflict with the dominant beings. Bothersome forms, of course, were mechanically exterminated. It interested us to see in some of the very last and most decadent sculptures a shambling primitive mammal, used sometimes for food and sometimes as an amusing buffoon by the land dwellers, whose vaguely simian and human foreshadowings were unmistakable. In the building of land cities, the huge stone blocks of the high towers were generally lifted by vast winged pterodactyls of a species heretofore unknown to paleontology.
Welcome back to Mo Banshee's Lair, Visionary Talk Radio, and we're on GCR, Progressive Inspirational Radio. It's the old Game Con. Check out our schedule pages. We've got a lot of new shows coming on. You've got a lot of favorites on the show schedule. Let me just look through. We've got my show is on Tuesday nights. You've got Dead End Road with Deadeye. What the Haunted with Kelly Spurlock. You've got Nothing But the Blues with Captain Steve, and I got to tell you, it's one of my favorite shows. He plays awesome music. We've got Jurassic Park with Doc Stan, Schizophrenic with Blondie, My Generation with Steve. So there's a lot of great shows, a lot of great music, a lot of great talk. There's a little bit of something for everybody, and I'm trying to talk Donovan into, we need a Lovecraft hour. Once a week, we need a Lovecraft hour, you know? So I'm going to work them over for that. But we want to give you some links and stuff, so start plugging away, Donovan.
Well, actually, since you're mentioning a Lovecraft hour, there were a couple of guys, Chad Pfeiffer and Chris Lackey, who did a podcast called the HP Lovecraft Literary Podcast at hppodcraft.com. And for over 3 years, my goodness, I think it was like 3.5 years, they basically went through Lovecraft stories in chronological order and talked about them. And the podcast is a hoot, and I was actually on one of the episodes. And so if you're looking for something like a Lovecraft hour every week, they've got something like 100 and I don't know how many episodes up on their website at hppodcraft.com. So there you go. You pretty much got it. You've got your year's worth of listening right there. And then the couple things I wanted to plug. Obviously, my website, the HP Lovecraft Archive at hplovecraft.com. It's pretty easy to remember that domain name. I was very lucky to get that. I've been running the site since, my goodness, what's it been? 1995. So I've been running the site for 18 years. And it just started out as a portion of my own private site. I found out one weekend I had some web space, so I whipped up a Lovecraft web page. It was like 12 pages or something like that. And then in 98, I actually got the domain name hplovecraft.com. It's real hard to get domain names, but I looked out and got that one. And at this point, there's probably about 550 pages on the site, including all of Lovecraft's fiction, which I added back in 2009, a smattering of his poems and a smattering of his essays. He wrote a lot of essays and a lot of poems, hundreds of essays. And so I've got a smattering of those. Long term, it'd be great if I could put all that stuff online sometime in the distant future. But much of that's still coming out in book form, and I don't want to interfere with that yet. So for the time being, I'll leave that be. I also wanted to mention a couple of books that your listeners might be interested in. A couple of them are at Barnes & Noble. They were actually commissioned by Barnes & Noble, so they're published through their private presses. One is called HP Lovecraft: The Complete Fiction. And if you've gone into Barnes & Noble and looked through their bargain books, you've seen these books that are leather-bound, that are classic books like Jules Verne and H.G. Wells and Arthur Conan Doyle and books like that are leather-bound with these really attractive covers. Well, there is one for Lovecraft called HP Lovecraft: The Complete Fiction, and it's just $20 for all of Lovecraft's stories except for the ones that were revisions and collaborations with other people. And I will have to warn you, though, they've had some printing problems with previous editions. So if you do go and buy that book, look on the acknowledgments page, the copyright page, and look for a quote that says, "The publisher would like to thank Martin Anderson for his help in the preparation of the text for this edition." Martin Anderson's a Lovecraftian who lives in Sweden, and he's been a big help correcting those. And so if you go into the store and you've got a copy of that book and it's shrink wrapped, just go to the front desk, ask them to open it up so you can check on that. So $20 for all of Lovecraft fiction is a great deal. Another book that they've got at Barnes & Noble by S.T. Joshi, who is the preeminent Lovecraft scholar. Book is called HP Lovecraft Nightmare Countries. And this is another one that was commissioned by Barnes & Noble. It's also only $20, and it's a biography of Lovecraft that is highly illustrated. So it's a very... ST's written a 1,200-page biography of Lovecraft called I Am Providence. It's a massive 2-volume tome, but this is like a 30,000-word version, very shortened, highly illustrated, and it's a good introduction to Lovecraft.
And I'm going to throw something out there. When the lights are out, or your power is cut, or a big storm kills your power, whatever, you can't sleep well, get yourself a good book, and you get to reading it. And there is nothing more powerful than your own imagination. I can make monsters up in my head from reading something that you can't possibly make in a movie studio, that's the imagination is incredible. So yeah, books are the way to go. Absolutely. I know a lot of people don't keep books, and I admit I do not have a large library, but I do have books that are important to me. Mark Twain, Sherlock Holmes, a lot of history stuff. I love history stuff and all, and nothing takes the place of a good book.
Yeah, and if you want to do a lot of reading, that biography that ST wrote of Lovecraft, that 1,200-page monster, it's called I Am Providence. The original hardback, it was 2 volumes, has been sold out for a while now. If you really want to have it, it'll cost you $300 to $400 because there's just not that many copies out there. However, the paperback was just released recently. So if you want to go to hippocampuspress.com, they've got the 2-volume paperback for $50. And I have to warn you, though, it's a hefty read. So if you're looking for an introduction to Lovecraft, that's probably not the way to go. Nightmare Countries at Barnes & Noble is a much better deal.
Okay, and we have some conferences coming up, like events.
Yeah, the big event that's going on this year is in August in Lovecraft's hometown of Providence. It's August 23rd, 4th, and 5th, and it's called Necronomicon, and it's a new version, as it were, of the old Necronomicon conventions that happened back in the late 90s. Back then, they had a convention that started out in Danvers, Massachusetts, in 93 and 95, and then in 97, 99, and 2001, they held it in Providence, and it kind of petered out. Well, there's a brand new group of people organizing it, a couple people from the original convention, but mostly new folks, and it's going to be a huge event in Providence. In fact, if you want to get tickets to this thing, you better snag them because they're talking about capping the attendance at 1,000 people, which was twice what the old Necronomicons were. So if you go to necronomicon-providence.com, you can buy tickets. They had rooms. It's taking place at the Providence Biltmore, downtown Providence, and they had, I think it was 250 rooms or something like that available. Those are sold out already. So there's already 250 people at least that have booked rooms. I'm sure there's multiple occupancies, so this is going to be a hefty event. They're going to try to open up some hotel rooms at some adjacent hotels, working some deals out right now. But it's filling up fast, and it's still, what's August? Let's see, 5 months away?
Yeah.
So that's filling up fast. There's also another small event going on April 12th through 13th up in Rutland, Vermont that I'm going to attend. I'm going to give a couple of slideshow presentations at. And it's actually a conference rather than a convention. So it's a scholarly conference that's going to be at the College of St. Joseph in Rutland. And the name of the conference is Weird Lovecraft, HP Lovecraft, Weird Tales, and the American Horror Canon. if you want to find out information on that, I think Mo's going to provide a link to it. And also right now, if you go to the Lovecraft archive at hplovecraft.com, I've got a little bulletin at the top of the page that links to it. Keep in mind, this is a very small event. They had a similar conference last year focusing on Robert E. Howard and his Conan the Barbarian stories and so on. They only got a couple dozen attendees, mostly local folks. So it's a very small, intimate affair. So don't expect this 1,000-person event that's happening in Providence. It's a very small affair here, but that's April 12th and 13th.
Yeah, I'm putting the links on, and it will be on the podcast, and I will put the links on also. All these links will be, if YouTube lets me. Lately, they've been telling me I've been putting too many links in, but I try to, get my guests' information out there. Just before we close, we got like 5 minutes. Actually, we've got 3 because the ending, the ending credits and everything. Let me ask you, he did not believe in magic. He was not religious, right?
Exactly. Lovecraft was an atheist pretty much his whole life. He referred to himself as a mechanistic materialist. He just believed that the only things in the universe were material things, the things you see around you. There was no immaterial component, and that we lived in kind of a clockwork universe where we didn't have any free will, we didn't have any choice, and the universe just ground on unceasingly, never noticing that we were even here whatsoever. And so a lot of the ideas, the supernatural elements in his stories, he simply didn't believe in. So you've got to be careful when you're trying to make a armchair psychologist interpretation of his stories. And remember that these things, these monsters that he included in his stories were a representation of that cosmic, the cosmicism that he believed in.
Yeah. When I had Michael Patrick Boatman on, he wrote this, the Revenant Road, and it's about, a black creature. It's very dark. And I says to him, so let me ask, did your mother, drop you on the floor? What caused you, you look at him and you think, oh my God, what a nice guy, what a beautiful young man. And then you read that and go, ooh, what happened to him? Wow, somebody stirred that pot the wrong way, but it's writing, it's an outlet. It's, something you love to do, so you find a topic and you make it your own. So I want to thank you so much for coming on. This was so interesting. I cannot tell you how interesting this was. And I hope you'll come back when your book's ready.
All right. Thanks very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Okay. And if you just hang on, as soon as the show is over, I think maybe, Matt, can you give him that link, the show on the Skype? Yeah, we'll give you the Skype, the show right there on the Skype, okay? So you'll have it right there, okay?
Excellent.
Okay, and with that, I want to thank everybody for listening. Next week is our St. Patrick's Day show. The Banshee, she's Irish, she's as Irish as it gets, and I will be playing Irish music, bands I love, American bands, Irish bands, all kinds of music. So you put on your dancing shoes and get yourself a Guinness and sit back for a nice Irish show next week. I think you guys are all going to love it. I want to thank Donovan for coming on. This has been incredible. God bless you all. Everybody that's got this storms coming, be careful out there. God bless you all. I love you all. Good night.
Where over the rainbow birds fly. Birds fly over the rainbow while
Thank you for visiting me at my lair. Mo Banshee's Lair is broadcast live on Tuesday evenings at 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central, 8 p.m. Mountain, 7 p.m. Pacific, and in the UK, 3 a.m. Wednesday mornings on www.gameconradio.com. You can listen to our recent recordings on Podomatic/Mo Banshee. You can contact me at www.asylumsgate.com. Again, thank you for listening. God bless you and yours, and have a very cool day. Chargers, for your phone, so you can charge the phone. Have your phone book, so in case your phone dies, you still can call somebody because you have their number and you can borrow somebody else's phone. Don't wait until it's too late, okay? So that's my little public service thing for tonight. I want to remind everybody that all the animal shelters are really struggling to keep up with animals that are being dumped, animals that are being just abandoned. Please, if you can help out your local shelter, please do. Animals did nothing to deserve that. And, if you think starving to death isn't bad, then you try it. Or you think that being out in terrible weather isn't bad, then you try it. So please report animal abuse, neglect, to the proper authorities, and if they don't listen, go to the newspapers. They love that stuff. Crazy Butt News. We have another comet that they're watching. It was just noticed this year, and it's coming close enough to Mars that many scientists are getting nervous that it might actually nail it. It's a comet named C/213A1. And it's going to pass within a few tens of thousand miles of Mars center, and they're kind of nervous. They're calling it the siding spring because they think it might nail it, graze it. They're not sure exactly how it is, but they're watching it, and it is supposed to be a rather large thing too. Let me see. I'm trying to go down. The comet would be moving 35 miles per hour at the 35 miles per hour at the time of impact, and it would create probably a 1.5 mile deep crater. So it's significant, but we're not going to get hit with it. But get ready with your little buckets in case Mars is blown apart, and you maybe can get some Mars, asteroids and sell it to NASA and get rich that way, I don't know. There's a deadly bacteria out. This isn't funny, it's not crazy, it's scary. I do not go to the hospital when I'm sick because I don't want MRSA. MRSA is almost drug resistant at this point, and I know so many friends who have died from it already now. But this new bacteria even makes that look like a wimp. It's called CRE, and it's rising in medical centers, in hospitals and nursing homes. People with impaired immune systems like me, I have lupus, people with MS, people with, autoimmune diseases are not doing well with it. And it's called a superbug. It's untreatable so far. They've found nothing that will stop it, except that the patient dies. So I guess my big thing would be is please people take your vitamins and don't go run into the emergency room for no reason at all. Call your doctor, tell him, look, I got a cold, I got a cough, whatever. But because this stuff is bad, and it's getting worse. The biggest threat to patient safety in the hospital is what we have, and that's from the infectious disease doctors for the disease control. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like anything is going to slow it down or slow the spreading of it. So please, people, wash your hands and don't play kissy face with people. Oh, I haven't seen you in forever. Kiss them. Don't do that stuff. Say hi. I haven't seen you forever, and I'm not touching you either. That's what I do, and everybody's okay with that. There's a drug group here in New Jersey that's been fined $45 million because they have one of these put weight on pills. You'll gain weight for people that are frail in nursing homes and hospice. They said it was a miracle pill, and it's nothing. It does absolutely nothing, and they swindled everybody that bought it. So this drug maker in New Jersey is in big, big trouble for $45 million in fines. And that's it. That's, I think, the crazy but news. We're going to be bringing Donovan on. Donovan is our guest tonight. And so we welcome to everybody in the chat room, everybody listening on Players, whether it's Winamp. We love you all, whatever way you're finding your way to us, we love you. And please pass our links around. Make sure everybody knows that we are now loading shows onto YouTube, and I keep the most recent shows on the Podomatic, and you can download from Podomatic if you want to save the show. New Jersey, from News 12 Weather Center, the National Weather Service has issued a high wind warning for coastal Ocean and eastern Monmouth County. That would be me. Effective through Thursday at 5 a.m. Coastal flood warning. That's going to be through Thursday 8 a.m. And another wind advisory till 6 p.m. on Thursday for Ocean, Western Monmouth. We're going to get nailed by a nor'easter. There are nor'easterns, and then there are nor'easterns. And lately we've been getting the big ones. And so I'm going to ask people to make sure you have all the things you need if you have to get out fast, right at the door. Make sure you have your animals, food, medicine, carriers. Make sure you have candles. Make sure you have water. If it looks like it's getting too rough to be in the house, it probably is. Find out before the storm hits where your safe place is, where the local school is that they're going to let you in. You can't wait until the water is coming in the door, folks. We are on the ocean. When you open the door here, the Atlantic Ocean is there. And it's not going to stop because you say, wait a minute, I didn't pack up the stuff yet. So please be smart. Get your animals in so you can get to them easily. And make sure you've got your cell phone charged, and in your little, what do they call those? Those little packs, your evac pack, your whatever you want to call it. Have your...
Second question. Are you now, or have you ever been, admitted to an asylum for the insane? If so, was your madness related to dreams of vast cyclopean realms or expeditions to ruins of elder races? I apologize for the wording, dear audience. This is simply being done to ensure your safety and peace of mind. Never mind the tattered pieces of my own psychological well-being. At any rate, continuing down the list. Can I get someone to shut the window? It's getting hard to read with all this damned wind. Oh, great. Just wonderful. How am I supposed to carry on under this shroud of darkness? It's not enough to halt the entire production now. Who is breathing down my neck? Oh, God, that stench! Jeffrey, is that you? Have you been dipping Cheetos in ranch dressing again? Where did I put that matchbook? Jeffrey, not so close, you'll drool on the upholstery. Jeffrey, I say, calm down, you're starting to frighten me. Here we go. Now we can...
Welcome to Mo Banshee's Lair, Visionary Talk Radio on GameConRadio.com. We are rocking your game tonight with Donovan Loucks, who has a site called HP Lovecraft.com, and it is a very comprehensive site, and you can find it at www.hplovecraft.com. If you want to maybe bring that up, people that are, using their PCs and all, you can bring it up and maybe look at the site while we're doing crazy but news. Let me just put that into the thing, and I'm so proud of myself that I got his name right. Loucks. And
the opinions and views expressed in the following presentation do not necessarily reflect those of GameCon Radio or its affiliates.
Mo Banshee's Lair, Visionary Talk Radio on GameConRadio.com. We rock your world.
Good evening, and welcome to the Howard Phillips Lovecraft Radio Hour. Tonight's reading will be a spine-gripping story, one of my personal favorites, The Picture in the House. Searchers after horror haunt strange far places. For them are the catacombs of Beg your pardon? You want me to warn them? Well, what do you mean, liability for audio-induced cardiac arrest? Oh, just give me the damn prompt. Many apologies for the interruption. It seems there are a few inquiries I need to make of you before we can begin the show. First inquiry. Are you now, or have you ever been the sufferer of heart trauma, brain clots, bouts of fainting, sweaty palms, cold feet, or other fear-induced maladies that might prevent you from fully enjoying the program? Moving onward. Second question. Oh, you can't be serious. Fine, just don't hold me responsible for our ratings drop.